Welcome to the Birth Launch Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts and learn how to craft your ideal birth. We will tackle the scary and weird questions that come up along the way and provide answers that are driven by science and evidence-based recommendations. I'm going to show you how to redefine parenthood and choose what's best aligned for you and your goals. With 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I'm ready to help you navigate pregnancy and explore your birth options to free yourself of fear surrounding childbirth. My goal is to help you have an informed and confident labor experience, plus an empowered and joyous postpartum. Hannah, welcome to the show.
Hi, Hee. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. I'm so stoked for today's conversation. I think that a lot of people out there who have had previous C-sections want to know about VBAC. They want to know if they're a candidate for VBAC. They want to know, okay, if I am a candidate, now how do I actually have a VBAC? What do I need to do that's different than maybe someone who hasn't had a previous C-section? So who better to tell us than somebody that has had a VBAC and an unmedicated one at that? So I do find that even with people who have had VBACs, a lot of times there are people who want an unmedicated one, but they didn't know how to do that. And so they ended up having a medicated VBAC. So I'm really, really excited to talk about how people can plan for a VBAC, and if you want an unmedicated VBAC, how do you achieve that as well?
Yes, that sounds great because I know that those two don't always go hand in hand.
It's kind of hard in our hospital system the way that it is set up now, right? Like,
hmm
it's really hard to VBAC. It's hard to find a provider. It's hard to find a hospital system. I mean, we know that some hospital systems literally ban VBAC. I mean, they literally say, we're not even going to have this conversation. We're not even going to help you
Right.
think through this option. So not only is it kind of a scarcity in terms of the support and providers that you can find, but I find that information on the internet can oftentimes be wrong, and it is really hard to find accurate data. And I think that because VBAC is such a taboo-ish topic in our conversation or in our
Mhm.
country, that the data out there is often buried. So parents have to go deep, 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 deep. And if that's not your forte, if research is not the thing that you love, if research does not come easy to you, it almost makes it inaccessible to people.
hmm I completely agree with that because I didn't even know the term VBAC when I went to prepare for mine. I had never even
Yeah.
heard of it. I just assumed everyone had a vaginal birth after a C-section. I didn't know it was such an issue.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So before we dive into the VBAC stuff, why don't you tell us a little
Mhm.
bit about your birth story? Because your first birth story ended in an unwanted C-section, or an unplanned C-section, at least. It was something that you did not go in planning for a C-section. You had one. What happened there? Tell us that story.
Yeah, so with my first birth, I did just what the majority of people do. I went to the hospital, not really the one closest to me, but the one that was most recommended to me. I went to my just a normal OBGYN. I didn't know there were other options. I knew people gave birth at home, but I thought like, well, that's just like a weird thing. Why would I do that? And I had never heard of a birth center before. So I just went to the hospital and saw an OB. And I took a general childbirth education class through my hospital. But I knew going into it that I wanted to go unmedicated the first time around. But I did nothing to prepare for that besides taking those general birth classes at the hospital. So I just assumed, well, I'm going to walk in and give birth unmedicated and everything's going to be fine. But when I went into labor, which was around 39 plus one is when I went into labor. And I will note that I did all the interventions, all the things with this birth. So I got like cervical checks and membrane sweeps at 38 and 39 weeks because, that's just what I thought you did. And my baby was measuring big at the end of pregnancy. So I scheduled an induction for like 39 plus four, all the things that we often see in mainstream maternity care, especially. But I got a membrane sweep at 39 weeks exactly. And I went into labor 39 plus one, so the next morning. And when my contractions started, they started intense right away, 5 to 7 minutes apart right away. And I was very shocked because most people had told me, well, over a few weeks leading up to your due date, you'll start feeling contractions. They'll gradually get stronger and closer together. No, mine went from like zero to 100 right away. And I called my husband and I told him like, hey, I'm gonna get in the shower, see if like this helps them subside. And they just continued. And then I called him back and because he was already at work at this point and told him like we need to go to the hospital right now. Cause when you have contractions, you just go to the hospital right away, right? And as soon as we got to the hospital and into triage and they checked me and I was 3 to 4 centimeters. And well, I thought, okay, I'm getting an epidural right now because there's no way I'm going to make it to 10 and pushing with how these are feeling right now. So we got back to our birth room, got admitted. I asked for the epidural right away. I got into my hospital gown, laid on the bed, got the epidural, and took a nap for a while. And I didn't know that you could like move into different positions with an epidural. I just assumed you just laid flat on your back and they come rotate you every 30 minutes. But I progressed rather quickly for a first time mom from what I know now. And when I got to 10 centimeters, or I got to 9 centimeters, and then I was at 9 centimeters longer than I was at other dilations. So my OB had asked, she was like, well, we could break your water if you want, but that's completely up to you. I will mention that my OB was so supportive, very hands off, kind of just go with whatever I wanted to do, which is rare a lot of the times. But she offered, she said, would you like me to break your water just so we can get to 10? And I said yes, because I didn't know any different. And she broke my water, and then I quickly progressed to 10 centimeters, but I labored down for a while. So I just rested for a little bit. My epidural was so strong that I really wasn't feeling much of anything. I didn't feel any pressure, didn't feel any contractions. So we labored down for a little while and then started doing some like practice pushes, is what the nurse called it, after a while. And like I said, my epidural was so strong, I felt nothing. Like I didn't feel an urge to push. I didn't know how to push. And of course, I was just laying flat on my back and my legs were up in stirrups. So I wasn't pushing effectively at all. And she was trying to explain to me how to push, but as a first time mom, especially, and then one that can't feel anything, I really didn't know what I was doing. And my nurse was not helpful with like offering suggestions on like, oh, well, maybe we could push in a different position because I didn't know that was a possibility. But as I was pushing, my son's head would come down and then just go right back up and then go down and come right back up. So he just wasn't making any progress. And after almost 4 hours of pushing, we opted for a C-section at that point. And when my OB said, well, maybe we should start thinking potentially about having a C-section, I was just shocked, honestly, because I had never prepared for it. It wasn't on my radar. I didn't know it would be an option for me. I just thought, oh, C-sections happen in emergencies. And I don't feel like it was really talked about in my birth prep class as something that happens often when we know now it does. And so I just felt really shocked and surprised and frustrated almost. Like, why is this happening to me? And of course, my mom comes back to the birth room because my C-section wasn't an emergency. I was just pushing for a long period of time. Me and my baby were both stable. We were fine. So it was just unplanned. And my mom came back before I went back to the OR. And of course, she's crying. And then I start crying. Everyone's crying because I didn't realize how big of a deal it was. I had had surgeries before, but obviously never anything like this. And when I got back for my C-section, I was surprised at how much pain I was really feeling because my epidural was so strong. I wasn't expecting to feel what I was feeling. They told me I would feel pressure, but to me, it felt like a lot of intense pain. So I was crying and telling my husband that it was really painful and that I needed like more medication or whatever they could give me to help with the pain. So thankfully, the anesthesiologist gave me something additional. But at this point, had so many drugs in my system that I was just very incoherent and I couldn't really process what was happening. I don't remember what was happening other than just pictures that were taken. So I like kind of dozed off a little bit. And the first thing I remember waking up was my husband saying, "Babe, it's a boy," because we didn't know ahead of time. And that's all I really remember from like being actually in the OR. And then during recovery, I went hypotensive. So my blood pressure had dropped really, really low. I guess I had hemorrhaged a little bit more than they had liked for a C-section, but not to the point of needing a transfusion or anything like that, which was good. But my blood pressure was so low, I was on the verge of passing out. But my main concern was that my son was able to nurse. So I'm like not even really with it, but I'm having my husband hold my son so he can nurse because that was like my main concern at the moment, not even the fact that I was on the verge of passing out. So it took a while for me to stabilize in recovery and to get back to really understanding what was happening. And then where some trauma really set in for me was we were being transferred from recovery to like an antepartum room because I had to have some extra monitoring because of my blood pressure and stuff. And you know how they move you from like one bed to another and they like slide you on a sheet in the hospital. So it was just me and my dad in the room at that time. My husband had gone home to feed the dogs and take a shower and stuff like that. And they had moved me from one bed to the other. And when they moved me, it felt like my whole stomach was just being ripped open because I was in so much pain. And I let out like, I don't even know how to describe it, like a blood curdling scream. I had never made this type of noise before. And I was like hyperventilating because it hurt so bad. And I knew that wasn't normal to be feeling that. And I just looked out the corner of my eye and I saw my dad. He was like facing away from me towards my son in the bassinet. And he was like crying because of the sound I made. And that was like the most traumatic part of the entire experience because I was in so much pain. I knew that wasn't normal. And it felt like someone literally just ripped me open. And that was like just such an overwhelming experience. And I'm thankful. Like I wanted my husband to be there, but I'm thankful he wasn't because I didn't want him to have to see me in that state. But everything after that, like in postpartum, was just it was hard. And I was trying to accept my birth and understand what had happened. And it wasn't until about 6 months postpartum that I realized that I needed help and that something was wrong. And I went to my OB and I went to see a therapist and I had postpartum depression and anxiety and PTSD. And when I realized something was wrong, I was having flashbacks to my birth. I was having nightmares about it. And I was just like constantly like crying. And at one point, I had blamed my son. I was like, why were you in a bad position? Like, you're the reason that this happened to us. And like, why wouldn't you come out? Because he was asynclitic and all these things that I knew were just irrational thoughts. Like, it's not normal to like blame your newborn on like how your birth ended up. And it was just so hard for me to like grapple with. And finally, when I went to therapy, it was someone else besides like my friends and family because I knew my friends and family were just trying to make me feel better. So they would just say whatever they needed to say to make me feel better. But it was my therapist that finally like acknowledged the trauma and acknowledged the experience and that it was something that wasn't my fault, wasn't my son's fault. So it took me a long time to really start like healing and understanding what happened to me. But I knew right away that if we were to have more children, like I did not want this to happen again. Like this could not be the way another birth turned out. So I never even considered like if we had other kids like scheduling a C-section. I just assumed that everyone went on to have a vaginal birth. I never heard the term VBAC. I didn't know it was such a big issue that had pushback against it. So when I started researching, I realized, okay, this is going to be like something I actually have to work for, something I have to plan for. And I started researching this at 5 weeks postpartum. And I'm sure that was a trauma response, like going into it thinking like, okay, this can't happen to me again. So I read all of the articles and the books and listened to all the podcasts and started learning what a doula was and like what I could do to prepare for a VBAC if we were to ever have more children.
Oh my goodness. There's so many places in your story where I thought it was going to go a different way. Like you had a great provider, but you still ended up
Mhm.
with an unplanned C-section. You had an induction, but your body still progressed totally normal. You know, a lot of times when we see
Hmm.
people having inductions, they're like, oh, my body didn't do it, or my body got stuck at this point. And you hung out at that 9 centimeter mark, but it doesn't seem like you got stuck per se. So there's so many places where like, oh, I knew what's coming next. And then that's not what happened in your story. Oh my gosh, Hannah, I'm so sorry that that was your first birth. And thanks for sharing that with us. I think that this story is one that so many other people have, right? Like you're not alone in this. And there are millions of listeners out there that are shaking their head, being like, oh my God, that is my birth story too. And carrying that residual trauma of, okay, I cannot let this happen to me again. So now what do I do going forward? And, you know, I know it's a little bit of a controversial take here, but I'm a firm believer that with trauma that happens to us, positive things can come from that. You can take that trauma and turn it into a positive. It doesn't get rid of the trauma, and it doesn't negate the trauma, and it doesn't mean the trauma never happened or that it's not still with you, but you can definitely turn it around and use it to do different next time. Not maybe not even better, but just do something different next time. I do have a couple of questions. I see you have
Hmm.
something to say. Do you want to say something before I move on? Because my
Yeah, I was
questions.
just gonna say, I will note that. So I had my induction on the calendar, but I went into labor after my membrane sweep, so I couldn't even imagine like how my birth would have gone if I would have actually had to be induced because like my contractions were already so strong, I couldn't imagine like being on Pitocin.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think too that your body had to have been somewhat ready and receptive for
Hmm.
those sweeps to work, right? Because we know
Yeah.
it's 50-50. So you're either in the 50% camp that your body is not going to be receptive and it's not going to work, or you're in the 50% camp where your body is receptive. So, yeah, I mean, gosh, how kind of scary to think about if you weren't in the camp of 50% that my body was ready and receptive and willing to go into labor on its own, how things might have turned out a little bit differently.
Yeah, and with my entire labor from like first contraction to my C-section was 13 hours, which is
Wow,
fast
fast.
for a first-time mom, especially with 4 hours of pushing. So it was still relatively fast, even with the C-section.
Wow. Yeah. So you basically had a 9 hour labor and then you just
Yeah.
pushed for 4 hours and then we had a surgery.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay. So my first question is how big was that baby?
8 pounds and so 8.5 pounds.
So a
But
big-ish
the
baby, but not a humongous
ultrasounds,
baby.
no, the ultrasounds were guesstimating around 11 pounds.
Oh my heavens. And then we had an 8.5 pound baby. Oh my word.
Hmm.
Okay. My second question is, do you think your induction caused your C-section? Or I guess you weren't
Um,
induced necessarily in terms of
no,
like what we typically
not
think,
like a
but there
medical.
were
Yeah.
but there were, induction methods, the sweep. I assume you had Pitocin, things like that.
So I did not have Pitocin because I
Wow.
progressed so
Okay.
quickly. But I will say that I think starting with the sweeps made things harder
Mm,
because I feel like because we know that sweeps can cause like cramping and discomfort. But I think having a sweep made my contractions start more intensely than they would have if I had not had a sweep.
yeah.
So by that happening, I got the epidural right away. And then I was immobile, like the normal cascade of interventions. And then I had her break my water. And we know that my son I now know he was asynclitic, so he wasn't in a good position. So maybe if I wouldn't have broken my water, he would have gotten in a better position, like those types of things. So I think I did have a cascade of interventions. Thankfully, I didn't have to have any Pitocin, but I do think that that led to my C-section. Also, because I didn't know my options. I didn't know like what I could and could not do. So I chose all these things because I didn't know any different.
Mm. And there was no malintent. It's not like your providers were coming in there with this, bad intentions or trying to manipulate you, which you and I both see in the birth room. There are absolutely
Mhm.
providers that do that. But I think a lot more often we see situations like this. And I know that
Mhm.
online providers in the hospital system can be demonized. And look, I'm guilty of it too. And the hospital system deserves to be demonized on so many levels. I'm not going to make excuses for them, but that's not your story. And I think there are so many stories out
Mm-mm.
there where Nobody had bad intentions. It wasn't intentional manipulation. It wasn't intentional fear mongering, but the providers just suggested this and you didn't know any better. You didn't know any different. You didn't know what questions to ask. So you just went with it and it turned out differently than what you had expected. So you have kind of touched on things you might have done differently, but is there anything that, one pivotal moment or one pivotal decision, or maybe there's a couple of things that you think like, if I had done these things differently, maybe my birth had not, it wouldn't have ended up as a cesarean. Is there anything like that?
So my biggest thing would be not preparing and doing the work ahead of
Mm,
time for going unmedicated.
yeah.
Because I feel like if I would have gone unmedicated, things would have played out differently because I could have gotten into a good position. My baby could have gotten into a good position. I just think the whole birth would have been different if I would have been able to go unmedicated that first time around. But I didn't put in the work. And I know now, and now that I had an unmedicated birth, that it takes work. It's not just
Hmm.
something you can walk in and do. I mean, you could, but it's not necessarily going to be a positive experience. But doing that, and then also just knowing my rights, knowing my options, and knowing what I can and cannot do. Because even though my team was supportive and wasn't manipulative, they didn't present different options to me. So my nurse, she knows, like she should know as a labor and delivery nurse, that you can push in different positions with an epidural, but it was never even brought to my attention, like as an
Mm.
option. I don't know if that's because she just didn't want to do the extra work to get me in different positions or if she wasn't knowledgeable on it. But just knowing all of my options and what I could have done differently would have made a difference.
Which is kind of the risk going into L&D units, right? It is who's on call. It's whoever gets assigned to
Mhm.
you. It's not like you get to handpick your doctor or your nurse. Now, some hospitals, some facilities, your doctor will attend your labor, but that's the minority in the US. For the most
Mhm.
part, we are walking into hospital facilities that have revolving door providers, and it is whoever is on call, and you are kind of at the mercy of what that provider or that nurse knows and is willing to share with you if you don't also have that knowledge. And I think that's why people like you and I who do childbirth education feel so strongly about not going in with an empty toolbox, right? Like you have to have your own
Mhm.
toolbox to be complementary to what your providers and your nurses have so that you can work together. So if they don't pull out the wrench, you can say, "Oh, but I have this wrench. Can we use this?" Or if they only pull out, you know, a flathead screwdriver, you can say, "Oh, I have this Phillips head. Can we use this?" So,
Mhm. Yeah, just knowing that you're the way that the medical system is set up, your doctors and your nurses do not have time to go over every single thing with you
nope.
and all the research and everything and all the education. So you have to take some ownership of that
Mhm.
and do it on your own terms and do your own research to, like you said, to be complementary to what your doctors and nurses are able to provide to you. And I feel like so many women just go into it like handing over all the power and decision making and just being like, okay, like, here, tell me what to do. And they don't want to take that ownership and responsibility or use their autonomy because they just don't know any different.
Or they're scared, or they want to be a good
Or they're scared. Yeah.
patient, or,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think there's a million reasons that go into why people don't speak up. But the bottom line is you can. It is your right. And you
Hmm.
should if you want to have a specific type of birth. Now, if you go in and you don't really care how your birth turns out, you're really just there to have your baby and you're okay with any other decision that's made, then definitely you don't have to do that. You don't have to speak up. You don't have to do the work. But if you do have feelings about that and you do have preferences on how things go in your labor, learning to find that voice is typically a journey. Very few people are able to walk into a doctor's office or a hospital room first off and start advocating for themselves. I mean, a lot of doulas even
Hmm.
struggle with it. It is a journey to learn how to speak up within the medical system. And I think that that is really, really important for everyone to walk away. Okay, Hannah, you said something about, I didn't realize that a cesarean was such a big deal. I didn't realize that it was such a major surgery. It was so, you didn't say life altering, but in my words, life altering. I think it is insane how we have become so desensitized to C-sections. It's like, oh, yeah, well, she had a C-section. Oh, well, I had a C-section. Oh, she's going for a C-section. Oh, let's call a C-section. But it's a major surgery. Like, from the top of your belly all the way down to the inside of you, multiple layers, skin and fascia and tendons and muscles. And not only does that those things need to be cut through, they then have to be repaired and then they have to heal. So it's not just a major abdominal surgery in terms of like the actual surgical procedure, but then afterwards as well. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe coping with the fact that your birth didn't go like you had planned, in addition to, oh my God, now I have all of this healing to do that I just did not ever consider. I didn't think about it. I never thought it was going to be my story.
Yeah, well, I will mention, so I've had multiple surgeries before my C-section. I've had a spinal surgery, I've had surgery on my
Okay.
head, I've had
Okay.
lumbar punctures. So I know what surgery entails. And my C-section was 1,000 times worse than
Wow.
anything I have ever experienced, partly because of the mental trauma from it, but also physically, like my body felt like I had just, like I said, been ripped open when I had been cut open, obviously, but it took me a long time to even want to like exercise or do anything physical because I just felt like my body was just in so much pain and it was broken. So just knowing like that it ended up that way and the healing from that, not just physically, like you said, but the mental healing that it took to really process that. And like I was so focused on like trying to heal physically, which is why I think I wasn't taking my mental state seriously until about 6 months postpartum. So it is a major surgery, and I feel like it's just looked at like just any other thing. And it's one of the most common surgeries performed, especially in the US. I mean, 1 in 3 women are having C-sections, but it's almost looked at as more convenient, I guess. And I see nothing convenient about having a major surgery, especially postpartum. Like you're trying to take care of a baby while you're trying to heal yourself. I mean, like I said, I've had other surgeries and they're like taking weeks and months and they have all these PT things to do. And a C-section's just like, okay, go take care of your baby now, like see you in 6 weeks type of thing, unless your incision gets infected. But yeah, they're just so nonchalant about it, I feel like, and they're not preparing women for what it could look like. And it's a disservice to them just thinking that it's just a norm and that like everyone does it. So why is it a big deal?
And then there's no follow up, right? You mentioned PT for knee surgeries and shoulder surgeries and hand surgeries and foot surgeries. There's nothing.
Mhm.
There's no, I mean, there is PFP2, pelvic floor physical therapy, but it's not prescribed to you. It's not automatic. A
No.
lot of times it's not
Mm-mm.
covered in insurance. It's out of pay.
Yep.
PFPTs are scarce, so you have to really dig deep to find them if you don't live in a major city. It's tough.
Mhm.
Being a C-section parent
And
in America sucks.
And women aren't counseled on like the long-term effects that could happen after a C-section. So like if your scar doesn't get infected or adhesions from scar tissue or doing scar tissue work, because there's women that have had C-sections and then 20 years later they're having issues with their pelvic floor and it's all from their C-section.
Mm.
And people just aren't counseled on that, on like what this could look like. Or if they want to have a large family, like what their birth options are going to look like in the future. There's just not enough counseling around it. It's just so nonchalant about it.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think it really does go back to the way that our country views VBAC. I mean, I think it's the fact that VBACs are looked at as risky or dangerous or almost negligent, that that parent is negligent for even wanting to have a VBAC, even though we know having a vaginal delivery after a C-section is oftentimes safer than going under the knife for a second major abdominal surgery. Okay, so talk to us about what you did to avoid a second C-section. How did you, I guess let's start at that 5 months postpartum. You, or 5 weeks postpartum. You sat down and you were like, all right, I cannot have this happen again. What was your very first thing that you Googled? Where did you, what was your very first line of start?
Yeah, so I just looked up like birth options after a C-section.
Mm,
Like, 'cause I didn't know the word, I didn't know the term VBAC. So
Yeah.
I just looked up like birth after C-section and then like VBAC came up and I was like, okay, like let's look at this. But then I saw like all like the scary things like, oh, your uterus could rupture or it's easier just to, like schedule another C-section. And a family member of mine just said, well, at least you know you can schedule the rest of them. And I was just like, what? Like, I'm not scheduling anything because I have family members that have had multiple C-sections. So I started Googling that and then I learned what a doula was from a birth podcast when I was looking up feedback. And I was like, oh, well, I'm definitely going to have that for my next birth. I'm going to have that support there. And then I heard what a birth center was. But again, I'm in Indiana, and in Indiana, it's illegal to VBAC in freestanding birth centers. So there are like legalities around that. So I was like, well, that's out the window. That's not an option. So it's either home or hospital again. So yeah, I just looked into like options for like birth location, options for birth support, what I should be doing like physically to heal my body because like I said, my body was just felt like a train wreck. So I went to see a pelvic floor physical therapist, like you mentioned, and got evaluated there and started going to like a chiropractor. So I started doing all the things before I was even pregnant again because I just didn't want to wait till I was pregnant again. I wanted to start preparing now. I was like, I don't even know if we will be able to get pregnant again or what that's going to look like, but I'm going to do the work now. And then I looked in specifically on how I could prepare for an unmedicated birth in the future. And I knew that a doula would help with that. So I started actually interviewing doulas before we even conceived. Because in my area, I learned doulas book up fast, especially the good ones. And my doula has been a doula that I had for my VBAC 20 plus years. She's attended over 100 VBACs. And she was the first doula I interviewed. And then I ended up coming back to her after all the other interviews as well. And she really gave me a lot of resources and tools and education on going unmedicated. And I ended up taking a course called Hypno Babies for my VBAC to prepare to go unmedicated because what I see a lot of now that I know more and I've supported women and I've conversed with women is everyone's so like preoccupied about like the physical aspect of preparing for a VBAC. But for me, I knew it would be like the mental prep that I needed to do because you can do all the things physically but your mind's going to give up way before your body does. And I
Amen.
knew that I had, yeah, I knew that I had to heal and work through my birth trauma. I had to really understand what happened in my first birth. And I knew I had to prepare my mind mentally to go unmedicated because that's where I gave up first time. I was like, well, these contractions are too hard. Let's get an epidural. So I knew that mental prep was going to be the most important for me. So yeah, I ended up taking hypno babies and then I worked with my doula once we found out I was pregnant and hired her and really worked on just I feel like I was already so educated up to this point. She even mentioned that. She was like, well, there's not a lot of like educating for me to do with you because you've already done everything. But just working on like knowing my options on like providers and locations and what my options would be for those types of things. But like I said, birth center wasn't an option for me because it's illegal in my state. So I looked into home birth. And at that time, my options were either the midwives would not service my area because they were too far away, or they would not take a primary VBAC. So if you had never had a vaginal birth before, they would not take you on. So the closest one I found was 2.5 hours away, and I was just not comfortable with like how fast my first labor went. I wasn't comfortable driving that far first for appointments because that just seemed stressful. I didn't want to do that. And then I thought, well, that's like really far away, like for when I do go into labor, and I just wasn't comfortable with it. So I interviewed a few other providers and hospital-based midwives, and I ended up staying with my OB that did my C-section at the same hospital, which is generally not recommended for a VBAC. But for me, I had mentioned like I had a very great OB. She was so supportive. And when I brought up VBAC to her, she was just like, well, yeah, like that's fine. Like that's good. Like there was no pushback whatsoever, which I was so thankful for. And she didn't have any stipulations like you have to have an epidural just in case you need a C-section and all of those things. And she was fine with me going to 42 weeks before talking induction and things like that. And she was very nonchalant about like uterine rupture. She was like, well, there is this risk that like your uterus could split open and rupture. And she's like, but there's also risks with C-sections. We didn't really go over those, like the repeat C-section risks, but she wasn't like making the uterine rupture risk like a big deal, like a lot of people do. So I felt really confident going with her. The only thing that she would not support would be a vaginal breech birth. So I found another OB in my area that was comfortable doing vaginal breech, especially for VBAC, if I needed to transfer for any reason for having a breech baby. So I set myself up for success, I feel like, in all aspects for if baby was breech and if I wanted to go with my other OB. So I ended up doing that. And this time around, I decided not to do any major interventions. I didn't do any cervical checks, none of that. I had some funky things come up in my pregnancy. So I was GBS positive. I had subchorionic hemorrhage multiple times in my pregnancy. I had a marginal cord insertion. I had a partial placenta previa. So like all these things that could happen, like were happening. But I didn't let it like discourage me. I just like went through it and thought, okay, regardless of all these things, I'm still gonna have my VBAC. It's fine. But I didn't do any cervical checks. I didn't do any sweeps. So I had no idea where my body was when I went into labor. I was comfortable going, like I said, to 42 weeks before talking induction. And at 40 plus two, my labor actually started much differently than my first. I did not have any contractions, but I had like excessive bleeding. And I contacted my doula, contacted my OB, and I was like, I'm having some bleeding. And I had, like I said, a subchorionic hemorrhage multiple times throughout my pregnancy with light bleeding. But this was a lot. And I felt very concerned by it. So I called them. And of course, my OB was like, come in, we'll monitor you, we'll see what's happening. And their first thought was, you're having a placental abruption. And that was my first thought too, because I knew that was an option or that was a possibility. And I didn't think rupture because I wasn't having any pain. It was just a lot of bleeding. So we get into the hospital and they do like a check to see like where the bleeding's coming from. And there wasn't like any major signs of like issues or where the bleeding was coming from. My heart rate was fine, baby was fine. So they just thought, well, maybe since your placenta is still low lying, it's not a previa anymore, but it's low lying, maybe you're dilating so quickly that like your placenta's right there and it's causing some extra bleeding. And I was 4 centimeters at that point. And I was like, okay, so like me and baby are fine, like I'll just go home. um, because the bleeding was starting to slow. And we stayed for about an hour just to be like for our full monitoring. And within that hour, I had dilated another centimeter. And I was like, okay, well, I'm progressing and I'm starting to feel contractions now. Because when we got there, I was showing contractions on the monitor, but I wasn't feeling them. And I was like, I don't know if that's because they're just really dull or if I just prepared enough to where I don't I don't really feel them. But yeah, so at that point we had decided just to stay at the hospital instead of going home. And I had texted my doula. I was like, hey, bleeding's fine, it's subsiding. They think it's just because my placenta was low lying. And we're just gonna stay because I dilated to 5 now. And well, about 5. We got back to our birth room and I was GBS positive and I did choose to get the antibiotics. So they did my first round and unhooked me from the IV because that was like on my birth plan. I was like, I'm not being hooked up to an IV. It's not happening. Not happening. I'm going to be able to move around. And I had wireless monitors, which I was moving so much, the monitors just kept moving. So it was just like, why do I even have this on? But it was funny because I texted my doula and I was like, at 5 centimeters, when was completely at 5 centimeters, my water had broken on its own, which didn't happen the first time. So it broke on its own. And I was starting to feel more intense contractions. And I texted my doula and was like, okay, I'm starting to feel things. Can you start heading this way? And they weren't bad, but I was starting to feel them more. But I tried to lay down like with a peanut ball between my legs and listen to my Hypno Babies tracks. And that was just not happening. I told my husband, I was like, I have to go to the bathroom. Like, this is TMI, but through both my labors, I have like excessive bowel movement. So I was like, I just need to be on the toilet because, everything's coming out. It's fine. So I labored on the toilet for a while. It was about 30 to 45 minutes. And at that point, I was starting to sweat and I was starting to shake, and my contractions were on top of each other. My doula was not there yet. And I told my husband at that point, I was like, I need an epidural. And in the back of my mind, I knew like, okay, this is transition because this is where I feel like I can't do it anymore. And he said, well, Julie, our doula, she's not here yet. Let's wait for her to get here. You're doing so well, coping through these contractions. And I was annoyed and I told him, okay, whatever, like we'll wait. But I knew in the back of my mind, like, okay, I'm doing it. And my nurse came in and we had been in there for 45 minutes. So she was like, oh, is everything okay in here? I was like, yeah, but Morgan, I think I need an epidural. And she was like, well, you're not even hooked up to an IV. That's going to take at least 20 minutes to get fluids going before you can get an epidural because she knew too. Like she knew I was in transition. And at that point, my doula walked in. I told her the same thing. And she's like, well, how long have you been on the toilet? And I said about 45 minutes. And she's like, well, let's try a position change. Maybe that'll help alleviate like the on top of each other contractions. Let's get in the shower and get some water on your back. And I was very, very hesitant to get off the toilet. But as soon as I stood up and like had that like vertical position, it was like I was bearing down. We got in the shower and my doula was putting water on my back. My husband, I was hanging around his neck and we were like swaying. I'm bearing down, I'm grunting, I'm pushing. And the nurse comes in and was like, okay, like maybe we should see where you are first because I don't want you pushing against a not complete cervix. It's gonna swell. I was like, I don't care. Do whatever you need to do. I'm like, this baby's coming out. And I did have like a slight cervical lip. So my doula just suggested, well, maybe let's go get on the bed, get on hands and knees, change that position up so that lip will push back. So we get on the bed and I start pushing on hands and knees. And I pushed that way for about 10 minutes. And again, my daughter, we didn't know she was a girl at the time, but she kept coming down and going back up. And I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, this is what happened the first time. You kept coming down, going back up. So then my doula suggested, well, let's try a squat. Like, are you comfortable getting in a squat position? And I was so exhausted at this point. I was just like, there's no way I'm going to hold my body up in a squat. You are insane. But we got the squat bar. My doula and my husband both supported me to hold me up. And within 5 minutes, probably two contractions of pushing in that position, like my daughter flew out. Like it was just like so fast. So 15 minutes total of pushing, where the first time it took 4 hours. And she came out so fast, there was no head molding, nothing. Like she just flew out. And it was so funny because I was trying to bring her to my chest, and my doula had mentioned during our birth prep, like if you use the squat bar, make sure you pull your baby under the bar, not try to go over. And I was trying to like go over, and the umbilical cord was like getting on the squat bar. Um, but I was just so happy. I was just like, I freaking did it. And I didn't care what happened at that point. I was like, my baby is out. She came out of my vagina. I'm so happy. And I forgot to even look if she was a boy or girl because I was just like so happy she was out. And I was like, oh, okay, it's a girl.
Just a totally different experience than you had the first time. I mean, just
Yeah.
completely different from even your pregnancy, which seemed even maybe a little harder or a little bit more
Hmm.
tumultuous in the first time, but your
Hmm.
birth, the actual labor, seemed easier, maybe a little bit more intense, but easier in
Yeah,
some
it was
regards.
4.5 hours from first contraction to my baby.
Crazy.
And it was like no break. It was the most intense thing, but I
Mm.
would do it 100 times over because I was just in my zone and it was amazing.
And what was your recovery like from that birth compared to your first one?
So it was hard in different ways. So I had a second degree tear, which wasn't bad at all, but I had retained placenta, which
Mm,
we didn't find until 6 weeks postpartum. And then
wow.
I had to go in and get it removed.
Yep.
And
For the
then
DNC,
my
you had a
daughter
DNC surgery.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, at 6 weeks postpartum. And my daughter actually ended up in the NICU a week after birth. So I was sleeping on a hospital couch while trying to recover.
Mm,
So that made the recovery a little bit harder just from those aspects. But the physical recovery compared to the C-section was night and day. Like I was up walking immediately. I was sore, but nothing felt like painful at all.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like sore is kind of par for the course. I don't know that you can push a whole ass
Yeah.
human out of your body and not expect to be sore. It's kind of the most
Right.
intense workout you're ever
Yeah.
gonna do. The soreness is
Yeah.
is pretty normal. Okay, how much confidence did it give you to see your provider not freak out and embellish and fearmonger around the risk of uterine rupture? She just put it out there. She said, this is a possibility. It is low. it didn't seem like she was very concerned with it, but she acknowledged that it could happen. How did that feel to you as the patient?
It felt amazing because from the research I had done, I knew that so many providers were just, that's their hang up about
Yeah.
VBAC. They're like, no, your uterus could rupture. And they put all these stipulations on you and they say, oh, well, your baby could die, you could die. And that never came out of my doctor's mouth once. She just put it out there like this is a possibility, but never mentioned it again.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me feel so much like better about like, okay, this is the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
I never questioned it. And she never even mentioned like, oh, we need to schedule a repeat C-section just in case either. That was never on the table. So she just had so much confidence in me that it gave me so much more confidence in myself and my decision to have a VBAC.
And what is that risk of uterine rupture?
So it's for one C-section, it's going to look different than after multiple
Mm-hmm.
C-sections, and it's going to look different with Pitocin, so being induced. But it's a less than 1%
Yep.
generally, depending on the use of induction or if you have multiple C-sections.
Yeah. We have a previous episode about VBA2 see you guys. So that's a vaginal birth after two cesareans. So this would be your third birth. The other two were cesareans with Jen Camel from VBAC Facts. So that's really fascinating. Go back and listen to that if you are someone who has had two cesareans and you're looking to have a VBAC. Hannah, this has just been amazing to hear the differences of your two stories. I do have a couple of like random questions I want us to go into as doulas and childbirth educators. Yeah. Can we venture
Okay.
into
Yeah.
that? Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about that turtling that you talked about both of your babies doing. You're pushing, they're coming down. You can see their head in between contractions. You're not pushing, and they suck back up into your body. In the moment, you're like, oh shit. I mean, it just feels so discouraging, right? You're like, no, wait, where are you
Mm-hmm.
going? Stay down there. I just worked so hard to get you down there. But that's normal. It's normal for
Mm-hmm.
babies to kind of come down and then suck back up. So, talk to us about that. What did you learn from your births about that? And then, just as a childbirth educator, what do you want people to know about that turtling movement that babies do in the vaginal canal?
Yeah, so with my first, he did end up being asynclitic. So I knew that like that was contributing to that.
Yeah.
He came out and his cone head was like completely sideways.
Yeah.
So yeah, I knew that. But with the second one, I like I said that mental feat was hard, but just knowing that that is still progress and they have to inch down. They're not just gonna generally just fly out. That's part of how your uterus is contracting, pushing, and then when that contraction stops, it's just like any other muscle that's contracting and relaxing. It's gonna have a relaxing point, and the baby's gonna come back up. But just knowing that that's normal and that to work with those contractions and with the pushes and don't try to like force it because that's gonna just make things harder. So one thing with my second birth was I let my body push versus me like forcing the pushing, which is so much more helpful than trying to do that coached purple force pushing.
Mm-hmm.
So not getting discouraged. I know it's hard not to get discouraged when the baby goes back up, but just knowing that it can take a little bit, even if it's your second, third, fourth birth, to really get that baby down and engaged and going through with those contractions.
And a barreling baby, a baby that comes barreling through your perineum is much more likely to do perineal trauma. So if you can let your baby
Hmm.
kind of ease down there and allow your perineum and that the outer parts of your vagina kind of stretch and accommodate your baby's head and help
Hmm.
them come out a little slower, it typically fares better for you. So do you think, since your firstborn was asynclitic, do you think that with more time you would have been able to push that baby out, or do you think no, truly they were kind of just really lodged in there that they needed a cesarean?
So I don't necessarily think time is what I needed. I think I
Mm-hmm.
needed different positioning.
Mm.
So
Yep.
like knowing like if I would have been pushing in different positions, rotating my body, and then having not having my waters broken to allow like more movement of my
Sure.
son. Because once the water broke, he was probably just like stuck in his little spot. But I think different positioning would have been helpful throughout that process. And I think if I would have stayed in that position any longer and kept pushing like that, I don't think more time would have helped me.
Yeah, so really it was positional changes. Okay, so you also mentioned laboring down, which as of now is not evidence-based. What I will say about that is the research is shallow. So it's not evidence-based because there's no evidence to say it's good, right? It's
Mhm.
not evidence based because it's bad evidence. There is no evidence to say this is good and we should be doing it. And so therefore it's considered not evidence based. You seem to have had a very positive experience laboring down. I have been part of so many births where the parent has chosen to labor down and it fared really well for them. Talk to us about your decision making process of deciding to labor down, even though a lot of times people face pushback in laboring down and they might hear things in the hospital that says this is not evidence based. It's not going to do any good to labor down. It is still an option. So how did you decide to labor down?
So with my first, I labored down not really by choice. It was just like, oh, we're just gonna wait to start pushing. So I don't think that's the norm either. But I think maybe I didn't wait long enough just because like I said, I didn't feel the pressure or the urge to push. And then I ended up pushing for 4 hours. So I don't know if it would have made a difference if I would have labored down longer or not labored down at all. But I that wasn't really my choice. It was just like what the hospital, like what the nurse and my OB said, like, we'll just wait. Like there's no reason to push right away. With my second, obviously, like my body was just pushing. So I didn't do anything with that. I just let my body do what it needed to do. So yeah.
I think that experience of having your hospital staff advocate for laboring down is far
Mhm.
and few between.
Yes.
Especially what our team sees is that, once you get to 10 and you are quote unquote complete, your hospital staff is really eager to start pushing, regardless of whether you're feeling that baby down in your pelvis, whether you're feeling the urge to push, whether you're feeling that rectal pressure or not. They really, really, really just want you to start pushing. And I think that a lot of
Oh
times it
yeah.
can lead to people pushing for hours and hours when, had we taken a step back and said, okay, baby's good, mom's good, everyone's vitals look great, she has a well placed epidural, or she's, most of the time we don't need to labor down with unmedicated. Sometimes we find people that need to labor down with, not having an epidural. But for the most part, it's people who have epidurals. If we would just give them the time, I truly do believe that it would cut down, it would reduce people's pushing times so much. On the flip side of that, though, you must understand that for every hour or so that you continue to labor down, your risk for hemorrhage grows a little bit, not because you're laboring down, but because of uterine atony, because your uterus can become really tired. And we know that
Mhm.
postpartum, if your uterus is too tired and or you've had too much pitocin, your uterus is not going to be able to clamp down to stop your bleeding postpartum. And so it's a fine balance, and that's why it needs to be individualized care. It has to be a decision made with that person based on their birth, based on the factors in their labor and the staff that is there at the time. Laboring down is not
Mhm.
right for everybody, but it also is not an option for everybody. It can be an option
Right.
for you, and it can definitely be a safe one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So I think my last question for you is about stirrups. Thank goodness we are seeing these antiquated things go away. But how was pushing in stirrups? I know a lot of people don't really experience this anymore. Stirrups are becoming a thing in the past, thank goodness. What did that feel like? How was that for you?
It felt just really awkward. First of all, they're like
Mm,
hard, they're not comfortable. I didn't push in them the whole time, which was nice, but there were times where like we were just holding my legs back versus being in the
yeah.
stirrups. But we were trying because I was pushing for so long, like we tried like different positions with my legs, but not actually different positions and pushing. So the stirrups just felt really awkward and weird, and like I couldn't really move anyway, but like just uncomfortable. I'd much rather prefer like having my legs pulled back versus having my legs just like sitting up in stirrups. It just didn't feel natural, which nothing about it felt natural.
Yeah, that's what I most often hear about stirrups is that it just feels really unnatural. You also have the option for people listening to just put your feet flat on the bed. So your knees are up, you're kind of laying back, and your feet can just be straight on the bed. You can also get a birth bar put up there and use that as that counter pressure. Put your feet up on the birth bar. They don't have to be in stirrups if your hospital staff goes to get stirrups out. Um, Wow, Hannah, this has been amazing to hear your different stories. And I think so many people out there are going to really appreciate hearing how you prepped for your VBAC. Is there anything else that you want to share that maybe you did, or you wished you did, or now that you support people in VBAC bursts that you tell everybody if you're going to have a VBAC, definitely do this, or definitely don't do this?
So the number one thing I recommend that people definitely do is just process and understand your previous birth experience
Yeah.
because it's going to come up
Mhm.
again if you don't, and it could hinder your birth. But the second thing is there's a million things you could do physically to prepare and do the ones that feel good to you and feel right to you and that are based on your circumstances. So I went to a chiropractor. I went to a pelvic floor therapist. I went to get acupuncture because my baby was breech and I was like doing all the things to turn him or turn her. So I did all the physical things. But to me, it was worth it because I was at least knowing that I did everything and I was giving myself and my baby the best chances that we possibly could. For some people, it may be too overwhelming to do all the physical things. So just choose what feels best to you. If I were to recommend one physical thing that everyone do, it's pelvic floor physical therapy, regardless of if you're a VBAC or not. It's so beneficial postpartum, during pregnancy, for birth. That's like the number one thing I would recommend. And unfortunately, like you said, usually it's out of pocket and it's pricey, but I think that's the number one physical thing you could do to help any sort of birth.
I love that. Yeah, pelvic floor physical therapy. Look, you don't have to have had a baby. I go to PFPT and I've never had a baby. I've never been pregnant. As women and females, we carry a lot of our stress and our emotions get blocked in our pelvis. And there's so many things that are stored in our pubic region that, a lot of times we don't know how to handle that. And a lot of times we don't even know that we've got blockages down there, and not physical blockages, just tense muscles and out of whack pelvises, unaligned pubic bones, and your hips are tight. Your lower back is knotted up. It does not have to be, this woo woo thing. It definitely can manifest as physical hangups down there. So, definitely, I agree getting with a PFPT. All right, Hannah, if people were interested in connecting with you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so my website is ebandflowbirthco.com, Instagram at ebandflowbirthco, and then I also have a podcast called the Ebb and Flow.
Editor's note here, Hannah has changed her website to thehannahgill.com. You can find her on Instagram at thehannahgill, and her podcast is now called Motherhood Flow.
Love it. All right, you guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with Hannah and I today. If you are trying for a VBAC, surround yourself with good VBAC stories. Surround yourself with people who are knowledgeable and confident in VBAC. Follow accounts that encourage you to speak up and advocate. Follow accounts that share evidence-based, not fear-mongering information about vaginal birth after cesarean so that you can truly go in there, navigate the hospital experience, have a confident birth, and really, really speak up for the birth that you want and deserve. All right, you guys, we appreciate you being here with us today, and I will see you next week. Bye, y'all. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Birth Lounge podcast. Until then, head over to Instagram and find us at Tranquility by Hihi and give us a follow. You can also check us out at thebirthlounge.com.